In the garden of the house where I grew up, there was a beautiful copper beech tree, and in the summer I would lie flat on my back underneath its canopy of deep purple leaves and wonder at the majesty of its form and watch how the leaves would turn to a reddish copper in the autumn. It was undoubtedly my favorite tree in the garden. It was only much later on that I learnt that trees like this beech do not necessarily benefit from being alone and isolated, but that their survival and well-being depend on the forest community in which they grow. Trees are social beings, says Peter Wohlleben in his eminently readable and fascinating book, The Hidden Life of Trees. They share their food with their own species and sometimes even go so far as to nourish their competitors. There are advantages to working together. The reasons, he says, are the same as for human communities. A tree is not a forest. On its own, a tree cannot establish a consistent local climate. It is at the mercy of wind and weather. But together, many trees create an ecosystem that moderates extremes of heat and cold, stores a great deal of water, and generates a great deal of humidity. And in this protected environment, trees can live to be very old. Every tree, he adds, is valuable to the community and worth keeping around for as long as possible. When you remove trees from a forest or wood, you leave many large gaps in the tree canopy, leaving the remaining trees vulnerable to storms and fatality. Communities like ours can learn so much from trees, from the degrees of connection they have with one another, the friendships they nurture, and the language trees speak with each other, a language of gas emissions, electrical signals, or release of pheromones that register pain, warnings against attack, and summons to predators that can stave off insect attacks. And there is also a language of love and protection, sharing of resources, and synchronization of growth and development so that trees in a forest can grow at similar rates. What about trees in the Hebrew Bible? Ubiquitous from the very first chapter of Genesis, they form part of the biblical landscape. And they're also important symbols, as we just sang, Eitz Chaim. The tree of life is a symbol of wisdom. Trees can be symbols of humility and greatness, of resilience and strength, faithfulness and judgment. Got carried away a bit, as you can see. In this slide, we have one example. No, wrong slide. On this slide are the names of a number of different trees mentioned throughout the Bible. There are probably more than 36 species of trees, including different kinds of shrubs mentioned in Tanakh, along with general reference to trees. I think there's something like 2,500 references to a tree or trees or specific trees or shrubs. I've put here what I think are trees, but I think a tamarisk might be a shrub, but you'll tell me afterwards because I'm no botanist. In this slide, we have one example of a reference to trees in general, the creation of vegetation and trees in Genesis 1. The second quotation is a reference to acacia wood, from which the Ark of the Covenant was made. And thirdly, a curious verse in Genesis about Jacob, who takes fresh shoots from poplar, almond, and plane trees, peels off white strips of bark, and to effects a kind of genetic experiment that results in the flocks he's looking after conceiving and bringing forth young that are striped, speckled, and spotted, and all these special animals, as they're referred to, which are sturdier than his father-in-law's Laban's, he keeps for himself, and in this way becomes a very rich man. Next reference I found particularly interesting because it makes reference to the Queen of Sheba's gifts to King Solomon, including a huge quantity of almog wood, which is probably sandalwood, which the king uses as decorations in the temple and also for musical instruments such as harps and lyres. And in the next slide is an illustration showing wood being unloaded from barks, an Assyrian 8th century BCE relief. I'm not sure if you can see that very well. This is a quotation from 1 Kings 19. It occurs in the story of Elijah fleeing from Queen Jezebel, who seeks to kill him. And Elijah takes refuge by a broom bush, which seems to play a significant part at this point in his life. He falls asleep, and suddenly an angel touches him, tells him to arise and eat. And from that bush, he walks 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb. Horeb is Sinai, where he doesn't hear God's presence, doesn't feel God's presence in the storm and the lightning and the earthquake, but hears a soft murmuring sound. So this broom bush occurs right in the middle of a very, very important story where Elijah has a kind of transformation scene where he becomes almost like Moses, replaying part of Moses' life. Both the date palm and the cedar symbolize growth and greatness because of their height, hence the comparison of the righteous with these two trees in the well-known Psalm 92. Other verses in Tanakh often use the image of the destruction of great cedars to convey the humiliation of those who sin, as in these verses from Isaiah 2, where Isaiah rails against the arrogant and the proud, bringing the lofty and the arrogant low, and the oaks also referred to here. The prophet Micah uses the vine and the fig tree as an image of peace and tranquility. And the trees mentioned in this next slide in Deutero-Isaiah are witnesses to God's creative power. And that apparently is an oleaster. But you probably know this better than me. The olive tree is a symbol of trust in the faithfulness of God, enduring and eternal, while Amos's profession as a tender of sycamore trees is a symbol, I think, of humility and demonstrates the simplicity of his origins and lifestyle. And commentators often thought maybe he was quite a poor man, but actually probably he was fairly wealthy as a cattle breeder and owner of sycamore figs. Trees occur in the legislative parts of the Torah as well and play a role in our observance of Sukkot. Here, the fruit from a beautiful hadar tree is mentioned, which of course in rabbinic Tradition becomes the etrog, along with the date palm, the willow, and boughs from leafy trees, later on interpreted as myrtle. And these remain part of our beautiful practice of taking the arba minim, the 4 species, and shaking them. Lastly, in these examples from Tanakh are these verses from Deuteronomy, instructing troops not to destroy fruit trees during battle, from which the important rabbinic principle, bal tashchit, do not destroy, is derived, not only by needlessly and brutally felling trees, but any kind of needless and wasteful destruction. And this is Maimonides' codification of the law in his Mishneh Torah, which widens the prohibition against destruction to include the destruction of utensils, clothing, buildings, sources of water, and food. I want to conclude this very limited introduction to trees in the Torah with a handful of rabbinic reflections on creation, which I hope will offer a little bit of an introduction to our Tu Bishvat Shabbaton discussions, lectures, and activities later on. The first, a commentary from Rashi, the 11th century biblical commentator, who offers this insight into Adam's birthplace. Even though the trees and grasses had been created on the 3rd day of creation, until the creation of the human being on day 6, everything waited at the lip of the ground to sprout forth. And why did the flora wait? Because until the appearance of the first human being, there was no one to realize how badly the grass needed rain to grow, and no one to work and pray for change. Rabbi Natan Levi, in a contemporary commentary to this midrash, says, "The grass could have grown, the bushes could have burst forth, but God wanted to teach humanity its first fundamental lesson. When it comes to the environment, it is up to you to notice what is lacking, and it's up to you to be the agents of change. Prayer and work are the tools at your disposal. Do not let the world remain barren. Do not accept brokenness." And following on from this midrash is the famous saying from Pirkei Avot, that it's not up to us to finish the task, but nor are we ever free to desist from the work. The first human beings, then, are confronted with the task of sustainability, and their lesson remains our lesson and task for the future. As we are taught in this well-known midrash from Kohelet Rabbah, "Behold my works, how beautiful and commendable they are. All that I have created for your sake, I created it. Pay heed that you do not corrupt and destroy my universe, for if you corrupt it, there is no one to repair it after you."